This is a continuation of the reading from Meditations on the Tarot, Letter 15, The Devil. Light drives out darkness. This simple truth is the practical key to the problem of how to combat demons. A demon perceived, that is, on whom the light of consciousness is thrown, is already a demon rendered impotent. This is why the Desert Fathers and other solitary saints had so much experience with demons. They cast their light on them. And they did so as representatives of human consciousness in general. For whoever withdraws from the world becomes representative of the world. He becomes a son of man. And being a son of man, the solitary saint attracted the demons haunting the subconscious of mankind, making them appear, that is, bringing to them the light of consciousness, and thus rendering them impotent. Whilst Saint Athanasius the Great struggled against human errors and deprivations in the daylight of his public life as Bishop of Alexandria, his friend and brother, Saint Anthony the Great, in the solitude of the Egyptian desert, struggled against the demons whose doings in the darkness of the subconscious were stirring up these very errors and deprivations. Entities of the hierarchies of the left must be convinced during the course of real testing that they are wrong. There is no other means of making them go away. It was the same in the case of Tobias and the demon Asmodeus. Tobias had proved, having spent 3 nights in the wedding chamber with his fiancée in prayer, that he was one of those such as go about their marrying with all thought of God shut out of their hearts and minds, wholly intent on their lust, as if they were horse or mule, brutes without reason, that he was not one of those. Having done so, the Archangel Raphael made the demon leave and go to Egypt. The demon was therefore vanquished by the demonstration of the fact that Tobias was not like the 7 preceding suitors for Sarah's hand. The demon who loved Sarah wanted to protect her against a marriage that he believed would be unworthy of her. Tobias proved that he was a husband worthy of her. Without this, the heart and liver of the fish alone would not have sufficed to make the demon give up his place as Sarah's protector to the Archangel Raphael and Tobias. These examples are in themselves sufficient to understand the nature of the entities of hierarchies of the left and the way in which they operate, and likewise show how one struggles against them. They are critical spirits, that is, prosecutors, and one can vanquish them only by convincing them, under laboratory conditions so to say, that the accusation lacks foundation, which is exceptional and difficult. For their accusation is usually the result of work done with indefatigable zeal, and with a very lucid and very well informed intelligence. Save for the intimate human domain of moral conscience, which is not accessible to them. And it is precisely the intimate domain of moral conscience from whence the decisive factor can arise, which can turn the accusation to the advantage of the accused. Because one is righteous and holy, only if good and evil fall into agreement that it is so. This is why the procedure with an advocatus diaboli is not only allowed but also is required preceding the declaration of a new saint by the Church. Concerning their function as prosecutor, entities of the hierarchies of the left fulfill it in a number of quite different ways. Some do it in the tragic sense of having to do what they no longer want to do and they no longer believe. Others do it with fierce conviction and passionate indignation. There are also entities from the hierarchies of the left who accuse by making use of ridicule, farce, as a means of demonstrating their prosecuting thesis. An entity belonging to this latter category is known in the Western world. This is Mephistocles, whose portrait Goethe painted with astonishing exactness. As he is generally known, just as are Job's Satan and Tobias's demon, one can, without going beyond the limits of discretion in question, add the example of Mephistocles to those of the Satan of Job and the demon of Tobias. I believe, dear unknown friend, that the preceding has portrayed with sufficient clarity, firstly, the difference between, on the one hand, demons engendered artificially through human will and imagination, and on the other hand, entities of the hierarchies of the left, and secondly, that the 15th arcana of the tarot is that of the generation and the enslaving role of so-called artificial demons, the Tibetan tulpas. It is a warning which says that we certainly have the force to generate demons, but that the use of this force will render the generator a slave of the generated. There still remains one last question for us. Were all of the pagan gods always demons, collectively engendered egregores? Is paganism in general simply a cult of demons? Before answering this question, one has to distinguish between the paganism of the philosophers and initiates into the mysteries, symbolic and mythological paganism, naturalistic paganism, and lastly, demoniacal paganism. In other words, one has to distinguish firstly between the paganism of Hermes Trismegistus, Pythagoras, Plato, Aristotle, Plotinus, etc., and the paganism of Homer and Hesiod. Then one must distinguish between the latter and the totality of cults of the sun, moon, stars, fire, air, water, and earth. And lastly, one has to distinguish between the latter and the totality of cults of divinities engendered by a perverse collective imagination and will, the cults of egregores, pure and simple. It would be an error and a grave injustice to consider the four paganisms as the same thing. For example, to see a priest of Moloch sacrificing human beings as a representative of the same cause as Plato. It would be a similar error to see the same light in the funeral pyres of the Inquisition and the lighted lamps of the Resurrection Festival, or even to see Mahatma Gandhi and a thug, a strangler for the glory of the goddess Kali, as representatives of the same cause, namely that of Hindu paganism. With this distinction made, one can say that the pagan initiates and philosophers knew of the unique God, the creator and supreme good of the world. The Bhagavad Gita, the books of Hermes Trismegistus, Plato, Plutarch, Plotinus, and many other ancient sources prove this beyond any shadow of a doubt. The difference between the religion of the so-called pagan initiates and philosophers and that of Moses is simply the fact that the latter made monotheism a popular religion, whilst the former reserved it for the elite, for the spiritual aristocracy, although they were often fairly numerous. With respect to the cult of the gods, and the iconolatry that this cult entailed. The pagan initiates and philosophers saw in it the practice of theurgy, i.e., that of intercourse with entities of the celestial hierarchies, either by raising themselves to them or by rendering possible their descent and presence on earth, in the sanctuaries or temples or elsewhere. Hermes Trismegistus and Iamblichus treat this subject with sufficient clarity. Thus Iamblichus says, they, the Egyptians, also establish a pure intellect above the world, and one impartial intellect in the whole world, and another which is distributed into all the spheres. And these things they do not survey by mere reason alone, but through the sacerdotal theurgy. They announce that they are able to ascend to more elevated and universal essences, and to those that are established above fate, viz. To God and the demiurges, neither employing matter nor assuming any other thing besides, except the observation of a suitable time. This deific and anagogic path Hermes indeed narrated. Again, such gods as are truly divinities are alone the givers of good, alone associate with good men and with those that are purified by the sacerdotal art, and from those amputate all vice and every passion. When these also impart their light, that which is evil and at the same time demoniacal vanishes from before more excellent natures. In the same manner as darkness when light is present, nor is it able to disturb the urges in the smallest degree, who receive from this light every virtue, obtain worthy manners, become orderly and elegant in their actions, are liberated from passions, and purified from every disorderly notion, and from atheistical and unholy conduct. These are the principal traits of the theurgy of the paganism of the initiates and philosophers. It goes without saying that the paganism of the initiates and sages, when not degenerated, had nothing to do with the cult of collectively engendered demons. The paganism of the poets, symbolic and mythological paganism, was, insofar as it was not a symbolic version of the wisdom and magic theurgy of the mysteries, a universal humanism. Its gods were, truth to tell, human personages, heroes and heroines, divinized or poetized, who were the prototypes of the development of the human personality, that is, planetary and zodiacal types. Thus, Jupiter, Juno, Mars, Venus, Mercury, Diana, Apollo were not at all demons, but leading prototypes of the development of the human personality, who, in their turn, corresponded to cosmic, planetary, and zodiacal principles. Concerning the third form of paganism, naturalistic paganism, it was cosmolatry. That is, it did not go beyond the limits of nature, like natural science today. It was therefore neutral from the point of view both of the true spiritual world and of the demons. It accepted the latter as a fact with which it had to come to terms. But in bowing before nature, it did not engender demons, because this would be contrary to nature. For the generation of demons presupposes a perverse will and imagination. There remains, lastly, the fourth form of paganism, that of the worship of collectively engendered demons. This form of paganism, which is due to the degeneration of the three other forms, and above all of naturalistic paganism, is the only form of paganism where demons were engendered, worshipped, and obeyed, and which led to the whole of paganism being renamed unjustly and calumniously as the demoniacal religion. The Church Fathers, who, with a few exceptions, treated it as such, had in truth to do above all with degenerate paganism, and, consequently, were writing seeing in the popular pagan cult of their time either the cult of demons or the fables of poets. But those amongst them such as Clement of Alexandria, Origen, St. Augustine, and Synesius, who had knowledge of the paganism of the initiates and philosophers, which was the pure essence of paganism as such, spoke of what all men possessed as a healthy anticipation of the moral doctrine. As Origen expressed it, there is nothing amazing about it if the same God has implanted in the souls of all men the truths which he taught through the prophets and the Saviour. This is something quite different from paganism as the worship of demons. With respect to Christian hermeticism, it cannot see otherwise than that as the coming of Jesus Christ was an event of universal significance. It had its universal preparation, that just as the prophets of Israel until John the Baptist prepared the coming of Jesus in the flesh, so did the initiates, sages, and righteous men of the whole world prepare the world for his word and his spirit. The incarnated Logos was awaited everywhere, wherever one suffered, died, believed, hoped, loved. The Jews prepared for the incarnation. The pagans prepared themselves to recognize the Logos. Thus, Christianity had its precursors everywhere. The choir of precursors included not only the prophets of Israel, but also the initiates and sages of paganism.